Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Today I would like presentation about chapter 13 is rating the philosophy of education. Earlier I will introduce our groups which consists of first is me, Laily Mawlidatul Mukarromah, name A3201902488, and second is Nezwa Shukhufi Maula, name A3201902449, and the last is Nabilla Putri Tiffani, name A32019025. In this first is introduction. In introduction, by now the reader, even if he or she is new to the field but has gone through this book chapter by chapter, will have read enough philosophy of education to have given up the expectation if she or even had in the first place that any of this philosophy of education business is straightforward. The chapter focuses on the distinction between philosophy as sometimes we read and something that we do the latter as a matter of discussion, argument, or to use a term that will central to what follows, dialogue, a process in which two or more people toss ideas back and forward in a more focused version of ordinary conversation. Sometimes they set out an idea in a few sentences, sometimes they seek clarification either from each other or by interrogating what they have just said. They matter over or request example. They may agree, object, complain of confusion, and so on. It may seem odd to read of philosophy as sometimes which should not ideally be written, and I shall indeed conclude that there are many oddities that are interesting, suggestive, and enriching. First, however, we shall consider a few examples of the many philosophers who have claimed to value philosophical dialogue or philosophical texts. In the next slide is Plato and dialogue. At the beginning of what we know then of a systematic Western philosophy, there was one influential thinker, the Greek philosopher Plato, who was prepared to question reading, whether reading, that is, the written word rather than spoken word, was the proper medium for philosophy at all. The earlier works of Plato and perhaps some of his middle period ones are written in the form of dialogues very much as if they were plays. Socrates, who was historically with distinctive individuals who, whether or not they represent his or Plato's real contemporaries, and whatever the historical accuracy of Plato's portrait of Socrates, have many of the characteristics of flesh and blood people who may be met with anywhere and at any time. To return more directly to the topic of how and whether to commit philosophy of education to reading, it is necessary to examine in some detail the Platonic dialogue called Pages. Socrates meets the young man after whom the dialogue is named while walking in the countryside outside Athens, or this is unusual. Socrates is a city dweller, and that is where the dialogues usually take place. Within initial speech that a particular kind of language here, the language of profit and loss, of what pays and what doesn't, of calculation, can easily make itself at home and come to seem the natural language for grown up people to use, are very much, of course, as it has done in our own time too. Moreover, when that language is written down, or and in our time when it is published in the right sort of place and thus come to seem double authoritative, it can be peculiarly hard to challenge.
My name is Nezwa Shukhufi Maula, and here I will continue the presentation. Moreover, when the language is written down, and in our time when it is published in the right sorts of place, and those comes to seem doubly authoritative, it can be peculiarly hard to challenge. Petrus rightly interprets him to mean the living word of knowledge which has a soul and of which the written word is properly no more than an image. That is to say, philosophy that consists in lively argument and conversational exchange is much superior to philosophy that is written down. Risks hardening into dogma and becomes removed from any sense of what the occasions and persons were that prompted in the first place. To express the irony in terms of many layers to be found in the pages, here Plato reads a text which takes the form of a dialogue of speech, in which the young man Petrus is impressed by a particular mode of speech making, as sold to him by the sophist Lysias, so much so that he has committed to writing. Socrates makes a better speech, but still of the Lysian sort, and then, after a discussion that is carefully crafted and has a distinctly literary flavor to the modern ear, Socrates tells a story supposedly from Egypt that represents writing as inferior to speech. To put it more briefly, Plato reads a book, one of whose principal messages concerns the undesirability of writing. The next part is talking philosophy. Before we return to this question, we should note, in case all the above sounds hopelessly paradoxical and perhaps part of a bygone age, that the ideal of philosophy as vibrant spoken dialectic still survives. For example, the author of this chapter was required is an undergraduate to read his essays aloud to his university philosophy tutor and then defend what he had written against criticism. There was no question of handing in an essay to be read and getting it back with written comments and a mark. The foreword tells us that what philosophers do is argue. They argue with anyone who is prepared to argue with them. It is an interesting question which I shall not go far into here, whether there is something aggressive and perhaps gendered too about this conception of philosophical discussion and argument. The speaker summarized the speaker was usually a man. Paper, which would usually have been circulated beforehand for roughly 20 minutes, There would be a reply offering a critique of the paper which would take perhaps 10 minutes or longer. Then debate was open to all participants, with the majority usually making further criticism of the first speaker and his paper. Often in the bar later, there would be talk about people having been shot down in flames or having had their argument blown to pieces. Of course, rational debate is a splendid thing, but perhaps it is not always what it pretends to be. The next part is philosophy and literature. One reason why speech might seem preferable to writing is that writing lends itself more to stylistic devices, to literary techniques that might be thought of as getting in the way of meaning and argument. Speech, by contrast, can appear to have a hotline to thought, proceeding directly and without intermediary from the mind of its originator. Such a style makes for clarity and rigor the hallmarks of good philosophy, as opposed for the appeals to the imagination and emotions characteristic of more poetic and flowery uses of language. The presentation will be continued by Nabilla.
Okay, next my name is Nabilla Putri Tiffani. My nick number is A3201920250. The case seems straightforward enough, and elsewhere Collingwood writes in favor of the dialogue form and of the plain and modest style, proper to philosophical convention that make the form of a search phenomenon for its own feelings, and attempt to remotely them by recognizing them. But in the long-ended question above, I have omitted part. Just as Plato has Socrates' spirit writing in a written text of a great artistic sophistication. So Collingwood tells us that the philosopher must not use metaphors or imagery that call attention to themselves, and he does so with the wonderful and entirely attention-worthy extended image of philosopher as chivalry or lance grandeur. It is tempting to say either that the writer, as opposed to the philosopher in Collingwood, has refused to be surprised. One variation on the supposition of the literary thickness that philosophy may fall into can be found in a kind of philosophical writing that make us of mathematical or algebraic truths. This is worth illustrating at some length, since it was particularly common in philosophy of education in what something of its heyday. The two examples I take are from two philosophers who demand a special respect. There seem to be two oddities in these two passages. The first oddity in the assumption that good philosophy, her top of a clear and logical, is the best book about adopting mathematical notation, but the notation is itself metaphorical. The second oddity concerns the notion of clarity means model and confused thinking, but clarity itself contains a concept, metaphor, or at least one that generally goes unnoticed. Once we have felt the full force of this argument, once the pretension of mathematical truths and the demand of clarity and the rigor that supposedly comes with those demands have lost their hegemonic status. It's become easier for imagine another way of writing the philosophy of education. Philosophy of education that takes the form of take promise a gentler conversation, and if it draw a wide range of textual search, full of the figurative and the metaphorical of they are.